The children of the sky, the sons and daughters of Kine, the Nords. For thousands of years they have practiced a spiritual form of magic known as the Way of the Voice, based largely on their veneration of the wind and its personification found in Kine, the warrior wife of Shore. Nords are intimately connected with wind and storm, birthed onto the throat of the world with Kine's sweet breath, so it is no wonder they bear immunity to the woes of frost and resistance to storm. Skyrim, the throat of the world, Kine, their reputation as bards, epic songs and poetry, the Thum, all are thematically and culturally connected with concepts such as the sky, wind, storm, voice, and breath. These are the Nords that I fell in love with as a young boy, playing my Nord character in Oblivion that was loosely based off Connor McLeod from the 80s movie Highlander. In 2011, Skyrim changed things. Don't get me wrong, I was blown away, clearly, but some of the new lore that was introduced fundamentally changed many aspects of Nordic culture and intertwined it greatly with dragons. It introduced great things like the dragon priests, their masks, and of course, some epic dragon fights, and there's no debating the fact that now dragons are a far more integral part of the lore in both Skyrim and more broadly Tamriel. But I can't help but wonder what Skyrim would have been like if the dragon cult was not retconned into Skyrim's history, and if the Thum was not co-opted into the language of the dragons, but instead it remained a fearsome power of the Nords. I also have to say that for me personally, being the Dragonborn was tiring after a while. It got kinda old after the first playthrough, and in terms of role-playing, many builds and characters that I like to play are just not the prophesied hero vibes, so I would end up ignoring the main plot anyways. But if Skyrim had no dragons, it would naturally have no Dragonborn. The first pocket guide to the Empire had painted Nords as the epitome of the barbarian archetype, with a magic like the voice that could circumvent the pitfalls of that reality. Barely clothed men in the north are unrealistic, but when these men are born from the breath of a wind goddess, sporting an immunity to the cold and a resistance to shock, as they had in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, it makes a lot more sense. Another pitfall of the barbarian archetype, that is the mead-swilling, axe-flailing bearskin type, is that they're not organized like typical armies and may lack sufficient technology or siege engines to conquer or threaten more advanced civilizations. But another of their abilities helps them get around this pitfall. It is said that when they attacked a city, they needed no siege engines. The tongues would form up in a wedge in front of the gatehouse and draw in breath. When the leader let it out in a Thum, the doors were blown in and the axemen rushed into the city. We never see this, and of course the lore still exists in the distant past of the First Era, and yes, we do have the pacifism of Jurgen Windcaller to be thanked for denouncing the use of the voice for war and battle, but it also was said in the first pocket guide that Tiber Septim, the first emperor of the Third Empire, renewed the use of the Thum for war, and he made an imperial college of the voice in Markarth, so that it may be the mighty deeds of Nord heroes of old will soon be equalled or surpassed on the battlefields of the present day. Of course, we never saw this, lore was changed, but you kinda get the idea. Nords of 2011 Skyrim seem much more imperialized or imperial-like in the way they act. We see little in the way of the superstitions, blood feuds, battles between Jarls, raiding, ancient customs, etc. Even the landscape was different than previously described, however some could argue that this is for the better, but regardless, in this fun little experiment, I wanted to try my hand at a bit of world building, a little reconstruction of Skyrim's lore, a version that could have happened if dragons were not made such an integral part of Skyrim's history, along with many other changes. I'll try and use all the similar lore regarding the Great War, the Thalmor and such, and I'll even use familiar characters like Ulfric Stormcloak and other Jarls and the like, but ultimately I want to go through each and every hold and redo them in a way that makes it feel more congruent with the Nord's representation prior to Skyrim's release, as well as bring in a more polarizing diversity of culture. As I initially began this script, it was solely focused on removing the major dragon focus, but as I let myself get into it, I began writing plenty of additional alternate ideas for what you could call our ideal Skyrim. If you've watched our channel for a while, you would know that we occasionally make ideal videos where we essentially take a game or game concept and have some fun fleshing it out. We did so for a potential Elder Scrolls 6 Hammerfell, which is linked in the description, and ultimately this script out turned to be a similar thing, so it's no longer just about an absence of dragons, but instead it's a full overhaul of Skyrim, but with familiar elements to work with. I'm personally a big fan of modding projects like Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel, which are mod projects for the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, which construct other lands such as mainland Morrowind, Cyrodiil and Skyrim to be more congruent with the lore of Morrowind's era, that is, the early 2000s Elder Scrolls. And here I plan to do something similar, yet rather than a total reconstruction, I'm going to be using many of the familiar places, characters, core conflicts and themes so that I can create something ideal but not so different to the original 2011 Skyrim game that it would not be recognizable. World building within parameters is fun, but with all that said, let's get into it. First, let's make some changes to the timeline between Oblivion and Skyrim. You see, the 200 years of the Fourth Era really don't add much. In fact, it even harms the setting, and that entire chunk of time could be greatly condensed into a period of about 60 years. Skyrim, as it is, was built with a poor concept of time. Dharma refugees in the Grey Quarter seem as if there is a very recent problem, yet the eruption of Red Mountain and the subsequent Argonian invasion happened over 190 years ago from the time of Skyrim. That's nearly 2 centuries. Surely there would have been some sort of cultural development, integration, or solution in that amount of time. Also, look at things like the Great Collapse where Winterhold sank into the sea. It's been about 80 years and still there is but a few thatched buildings and what seems like no attempt to rebuild. Even the Great War ended over 25 years ago from the time of Skyrim. Everyone under the age of 30 would pretty much have grown up without the worship of Talos, and one could even doubt the significance he would have to them. I think Skyrim would have benefited from a much shorter time gap. It makes the continuity of the Elder Scrolls games feel stronger, and the events of the past 60 years would feel like important context to the game world and the characters in it. So I've made up a mock timeline of the Fourth Era with the big events, but they all happen within the span of 61 years rather than 201, and you can see this feels a lot more realistic. There would be old men who actually lived in the waning days of the Septim Empire. We could meet lots of elves that lived in Somerset before its new Thalmor regime. The wounds of the Great War would be fresh and make the stakes with the Thalmor seem so much higher. Veterans would be plentiful, which makes tensions all the greater. And at the end of the day, I think this timeline contains all the core events of the Fourth Era and adjusts them to a smaller time frame without making them feeling too rushed either. Just a reminder that 60 years is a really long time. 60 years ago was 1961. Consider that full-plate armored knights in our real-world history came and went in about 200 years. One other major change I would adjust to the lore of the Fourth Era timeline is the conditions of the White Gold Concordat. I would propose that Shore is the main focus. The conditions would remain the same regarding everything else, but the Thalmor demand that all worship of Shazar, Shore, Sheor, Lorkhan, Lorkaj, or any cultural variation of that god must be outlawed. Talos could also be outlawed for the same reasons given in-game, such as he's a man, not a god, and the outlaw of Talos would be big for the Imperials, but to the Nords, who in this version of Skyrim primarily worship their traditional Nordic pantheon, the outlaw of Shore's reverence would be the paramount heresy and the most impactful change for them. Having the main religious issue surrounding Shore makes so much more sense too, because Shore is inherently an anti-elven god, and in the Old Merry pantheons he is known as Lorkhan. It is basically the ultimate evil to them. So having the White Gold Concordat be primarily concerned with the outlaw of anti-elven figures such as Shaw, I feel is a far more motivated position, and I think this can set the stage for the Civil War far better. With the Great War in this alternate 61-year timeline having only ended 10 years prior to the story, this new adjustment can feel very fresh. The majority of Skyrim could be holding on to their old gods such as Kain, Junal and Stun and so on, while the more cosmopolitan parts of Skyrim such as Solitude or Markarth, may be slowly converting to the Imperial faith, leaving behind ancient customs, and this friction of change could be seen everywhere, and creates a good amount of cultural turmoil which provides ample opportunities for different quests and characters to interact with. This dynamic would feel far better in my opinion. It creates a very clear cultural divide between the East and the West, rather than being basically the same but with disputes over worship of Talos and basically land. Talos is an imperial god, and in Bethesda's Skyrim, all the Nords basically just worship the imperial divines now. This fundamentally acts as a lot of Nordic culture, and it's something I would want brought back. In the sections where I discuss each city and hold, I'll bring up the specifics of each place and their take on the Civil War, but ultimately, a clear cultural divide and active conversion of Nordic to Imperial would be really interesting to see. Also, remember in this timeline, the Nords have only accepted, and I would assume begrudgingly, the Mede Emperors in recent history, of which there have only been 3, and they've only been around for 48 years. There would be Nords who were pro-Empire when it was Septim run, but they've now lost faith in this illegitimate dynasty. It creates some real and living tension. There would be old Jarls like Jarl Skald of Dawnstar who swore oaths to the Septim dynasty as a youth, but no longer believe in the empire run by the Mede dynasty, and hence join the Stormcloaks rebellion. At the end of the day, I think this compressed timeline and focus move to the Nordic pantheon of Shor versus the imperialized way of things and elven influence helps the setting of Skyrim greatly and provides lots more believable tension and reasons for the Civil War. By the way, I'm also aware that this change of focus from Talos to Shor changes the unconfirmed meta-narrative about the Thalmor and their goal to erase Talos and undo reality with the towers, but again, these similar ideas could be retrofitted to fit Lorkhan, also known as Shor, because he was quite literally the god who trapped them in the first place. Also, I just want to note as well that by extension of the anti-Lorkhan Shor Shizar sentiment as per the White Gold Concordat, pantheons that venerate him as a chief or central figure get vilified on the whole, so things like the Nordic pantheon. But before we get to all the holds and such, we need to hit some fundamentals about the setting and needed adjustments to the main plot. The problem here is that without the lore about the dragon cult, the dragons and such, there's no need for a last dragonborn. Alduin would still exist as the harbinger of end times in the Nordic pantheon, but he would not have spent the late Merethic era as some domination-obsessed dragon overlord. Instead, he remains the Nordic equivalent of Akatosh. So, how do we approach the plot? I would suggest creating a more Thalmor-centric plot if we aren't going to have some mega dragon killer superhero chosen one plot. And after having read comments and posts for over 8 years here on YouTube in regards to Skyrim, it would seem that the majority of you are far more invested and interested in the Thalmor plot and the Imperial vs Stormcloak dynamics as opposed to the dragons plot. Alduin coming with an army of dragons is, dare I say, a little plain. I don't want to create an entire plot here because I want to get into the world building, which ends up making this video huge anyways. But big conspiracies regarding the Thalmor's involvement in the continuation of the Civil War, further weakening the Empire from behind the scenes, is good, and so it'd be cool to see that explored more thoroughly, and that made the focus of the main storyline. Perhaps it interconnects with the Falmer or something. Maybe they want Skyrim weakened while they cure the Falmer and raise an army underground. Maybe they discover an Elder Scrolls in Blackreach and want to use it for nefarious means. Look, I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but without the Talos Towers framework or without the dragons, it would have to be something different, and a Daedric invasion is just so overdone. Put it this way, the Thalmor have potential to be a far greater active antagonist, something similar to the Mythic Dawn in Oblivion or the Sixth House in Morrowind, and it would be cool to have some new faces and personalities to the enemy instead of a big bad dragon who is concerned with something as straightforward as destroy the world, because he is compelled to. Anyways, let's move on to the actual world building. To clarify, there were no dragon wars or ancient dragon cults, so when Ysgramor came and the snow elves were wiped out, things were different for the next centuries. I also kind of want to say here that the dragon cult, dragon war thing is already such a jammed in thing into the timeline that it would be easy enough to take out. Overall, instead of dragons, dragon language, stuff like this, we want the elemental components of the Nords explored more deeply, to see a culture of song, epic stories of heroes who attempt to emulate kings of old. Think of how characterized the Norse gods are in real-world mythology. The Nordic pantheon should have the same treatment and exist here front and center, instead of being replaced by an imperial dragon. One of the biggest changes is surely that the Thum has nothing to do with the dragons, and everything to do with Kine and her sons and daughters, the Nords. I think it would be really cool to hone in on the far more elemental aspects of this. When I hear some tongues possess a Thum so powerful that they cannot speak, I get amped up. Powers like swallowing thunderclouds, or controlling the earth, making thralls filled with mud, or creating clouds of acid rain by giving the clouds, quote, stomach aches, turning the rain into bile. The Thum should be an enlightened power of connection with the elements, rather than just dragon speak. A quintessential thematic debate could be about the Nords' use of this power and the ethics of it. On one end of the spectrum you have the Greybeards, who follow the pacifist ways of Jurgen Windcaller and use the Thum only for reverence of the gods. And on the other end of the spectrum you have people like Ulfric, who want to use this power for war to ensure that the Nords may live according to their traditions and not have to supplicate to other powers such as the Dominion, for example. This debate about the ethics of such a power could be a central theme. On one end, pacifism and peace is surely the best way to experience life, yet such unwillingness to engage in conflict enables the disruption of that very peace. And on the other hand, the use of the power for war enables you to defend what you hold dear, but it more than often leads to an abuse of this power and allows for tyrants and bloodshed. I think the philosophy surrounding the Thum should be discussed more in game, and presented as an issue known about and engaged in by the many people of Skyrim. If Tiber Septim founded the College of the Voice, and Ulfric turned from the teachings of the Greybeards, there should be more exploration of Jurgen Windcaller's philosophy and mentions of the destructiveness that the early Nordic tongues brought. It should be a multi-layered and compelling theme central to both the personal experience of the power and also its ramifications for the politics surrounding it. The other little gripe I have with the Dragon Cult and the Dragon Wars and such is that it replaces a lot of the history in terms of what is talked about. Like when you hear ancient Skyrim, most people think dragons and dragon cults, but we do not think of the songs of Wulfarth or the songs of Ysgramor and his battle against tribes of giants. We don't hear about Vraga the Gifted and his conquests of High Rock and Resdane, battles against Duameri and Chimeri heroes, nor do we hear about how it was the Nords who ultimately brought men to power in Tamriel, ending the dominance of elves. We don't hear about the Elysian Order and how it wreaked havoc on Skyrim when it was accepted by King Borgus. We don't hear about the individual battles against the Falmer from ancient times, nor battles against the Dwemer. We don't hear much about mighty feuds between the earliest Jarls, nor do we hear much about the clever men of old and their worship of Junal, god of hermetic orders. Ultimately, a lot of Skyrim's historical context in the lore is not presented front and center in-game, as in discussed and talked about by NPCs, but it is rather replaced by a focus on dragons and the dragon cult, which is placed front and center. At the end of the day, I think ideally more of the peripheral lore should relate to the Nords themselves and Nordic culture, aside from the dragon cult, which I feel took the majority of the talk space. But in this ideal version, there is no dragon cult, so let's get started. We begin at the beginning of the game, go figure. Ulfric Stormcloak has been arrested for murdering High King Torrig and the civil war has begun. Of course, whether he murdered or fairly challenged by ancient custom is up for debate depending on perspective and political leaning, but regardless, here we are in a similar situation. Ulfric escapes, civil war is in full brew, and since we're talking about Ulfric, let's talk about the center of the rebellion, the Hold of Eastmarch. Ulfric is the head of the Stormcloak Rebellion and Jarl of Windhelm. He is a fierce defender of the old gods and tradition. He and his followers model themselves on the Nords of old, those who worship Shor, Kine, and so on. Ulfric had fought with the Empire in the Great War, which ended 10 years ago, but after returning to Skyrim and the events of the Markarth incident unfolded, in this version regarding reference of Shor, not Talos, he had lost all faith in the Empire, seeing them as mere puppets for the Thalmor, no longer respecting the traditions of the Nords who since ancient times had always championed the causes of man. A few weeks before the beginning of the game, Ulfric Stormcloak challenged High King Torygg for the throne and killed the young king. The Stormcloak rebellion has swung into full action, and the holds of the East have rallied to his side. They crave a king who fights for Skyrim and will defend their traditions and gods. So naturally, Windhelm is the center of the rebellion, and it's a colourful place, more than you would expect from a home of the true Nords. The Grey Quarter is teeming with Dunmer. 55 years ago, Dunmer began fleeing Morrowind in droves after the eruption of Red Mountain, as well as the following Argonian invasion, and Windhelm was one of the main stops, though Riften also received an influx, but we'll get to that later. At the time, this refuge was facilitated by the Empire, and grants from the Elder Council's coffers were given to the Jarl of Windhelm in order to accommodate this influx. But 8 years later, year 13 of the Fourth Era, Titus Mede seizes the imperial throne, and rejecting this new rule, Morrowind claims independence. Following this, financial support was no longer given to the Jarl of Windhelm because the Dunmer were no longer citizens of the Empire. However, the problem was already there. The Grey Quarter had begun and more families and friends flocked to this refuge. Integration attempts were made, but with such a large population of a fundamentally opposed culture, it was difficult, and so this resulted in a Dunmer ghetto. Over the next decades, generations of Dunmer would be born and live their lives here, knowing no home in Morrowind. Racial tensions are very high, and there have been several massacres, riots, assassinations, and assaults at differing periods, even fires that have burnt districts. Ultimately, a program of conscription and indentured labor was implemented, and Dunmer would have to work in farms and construction, as well as units in the army in return for their citizenship. For the Nords in Windhelm, their place is a birthright, but for the Dunmer, even those born in the Grey Quarter, they must earn their place with service to the Jarl. You will occasionally see a smattering of Dunmer fighting for the Stormcloaks, sporting bone mold armor pieces made from the bones of local animals like mammoths and cows. Even some have chitin armor imported from Morrowind. Do not mistake these fighters as loyal to the rebellion though. They fight in order to ensure the safety and security of their families who live in the expansive Grey Quarter. The Grey Quarter itself is much larger, expanding to the Docks district, and it would be cool to see shanty-style structures done with similar decorations, lanterns and cultural banners and such that we saw in Ravenrock, for example. We would want Nords entering this area to feel out of place. There would also be satellite villages set up all along the road to refugees' rest, quarters and homes for the many who work as farmers for the Nords. Many of these villages end up being controlled by criminal groups such as the Comonotong from Morrowind, who run skooma into Windhelm, which is creating a growing skooma problem among disenfranchised youths in the city. Also, just because the Grey Quarter is all Dunmer does not mean they're all Kumbaya either. With a shorter Fourth Era timeline, the death or disappearance of the Tribunal and their disavowed status as saints rather than gods only came about 60-ish years ago. The Reclamation's faith has only been newly reformed, and there are many who scorn those who have reverted to the Daedra and instead stay faithful to the Tribunal, believing that they are not truly dead and will one day return to this world and rebuild Morrowind when the people rebuild their faith. So you would have a religious conflict of Dunmer worshipping the Tribunal, preaching a return to a golden age, whereas the ones who worship the Reclamations have become more in tune with the ways of the Daedra and have accepted their status is because of the false gods, and they choose to live in accordance with the words of Veloth. The newer generations tend towards the Reclamations, but on top of all this is the abhorrence of both religions from the view of the Nords. The Nords see the Dunmer as demon worshippers, whether it be Vivec or Boethia. They're all the same to the Nords, so there's a lot of tension there. The Nordic Windhelm, the rest of it outside the Grey Quarter, would be similar in vibe, but doubled down on the true Nord theme. Multiple shrines and statues to the Nordic gods, houses that paste canis root on their doors so that werebears don't attack, taverns full of storytellers reciting epics of past heroes, an arena made for battles over insulted honor and disputes, Vikings, as in the profession of a raider, at the docks who are preparing to head on raiding missions, master smiths who work with sacred Stalrim, which is also used in in the burial of kings and great heroes in the catacombs beneath an ancient and honoured tradition. You would be able to see the dead, non-decomposed corpses in their graves because they're frozen in magical ice. Sure, that may sound weird, but it's an ancient custom of Nordic burial. We want some of their customs and superstitions to show here and provide contrast to the more toned down, cosmopolitan and practical ways of the more imperialized Western holds. In short, we want the West to feel more like the Skyrim we got, and the East to feel more like the Skyrim we didn't get, in terms of base underlying culture. We also want to emphasize the elemental feeling of the Nords here, so it would be fitting to have a hall or temple on the mountain peak behind the city, or perhaps in the Velothi Mountains nearby. And here, the priests and priestesses of Kine come for reverence, but also the newly formed Order of the Tongues. In Ulfric's younger days, he trained to become a greybeard so he could master the way of the voice for reverence of the gods, but when the Great War came about, he refused to stand idle and used his power for battle. As he returned and became Jarl of Windhelm, he would begin the training of new tongues, powerful users of the voice and devoted Nords. In fact, many left the Imperial College of the Voice in Markarth to come to Ulfric because he boasted the most powerful Thum, second only to the Greybeards, and those he taught became more powerful, which is suggested to be because they live in accordance with the Nordic gods, specifically Kine, who gave the Nords the power of the voice in the first place. The Imperial College in Markarth is actually quite dilapidated and almost a bit of a failed experiment of the last centuries, never really meeting Tiber Septim's vision. Also, I guess, just to make some extra notes about the aesthetic, but I think the look of Hjaalmarch, the bone charms, the bearskin hood, the pelt draped over the shoulders and so on, this kind of aesthetic should be seen more often. It would be cool to see the Nords of Windhelm stick to the most ancient and customary looks, perhaps motifs that look similar to ancient Nordic armor, but made with modern standards in mind. Also, consider that woad should be used. If you remember in the older games, the Nords had a greater power called woad, and woad, if you don't know, is the blue pigment that Celtic warriors painted on themselves. This power in-game provides a temporary magic shield, and we can extrapolate from this that the Nords somewhat employ the use of woad to protect themselves, so that war paint isn't just for show, and we could use this to expand on the world building, having berserker warriors charging into battle covered in magical woad painted on them by sacred priests or shamans employing animal symbology to represent the gods. Fighting half undressed may seem stupid, but if woad truly is magical and substitutes armor in ways, then it makes sense. Using magic to make the barbarian archetype work is what we want to do here. There's another thing to remember. The depictions of the ancient Nordic pantheon use plenty of animal symbols in association with them. So Shor is the fox, Sun is the bear, Kine is the hawk, Mara the wolf, Dibella the moth, Stun the whale, Drunal the owl, Orki the snake, and Alduin the dragon. So throughout all the truest of Nords, these kinds of symbols and motifs should be regularly used. Ultimately, I think you get the picture, but we'd want Windhelm and more broadly Eastmarch to be full of Nords who embody what a first era Nord was like. And when you mix that with the Dunmer tensions, who themselves have their own divides, it can make for some interesting stories and perhaps world-changing outcomes. Like maybe you can become a Stormcloak and eventually you can choose to purge the city of Dunmer, pushing them out forcibly, or rather you can convince Ulfric that they can be invaluable, or replace Ulfric with Brunwolf and give the Dunmer the same rights in Windhelm as the Nords. Perhaps the Morag Tong continues as a hidden cult within the walls of Windhelm, and there's a series of quests regarding the assassination of important Nord clan leaders there. There could also be a market full of weird and exotic imports from Morrowind, and Nords who scoff at their weird food, or some of those who have embraced it. Guars carrying cargo in the street, Nords threatening to turn them into leather. I just think it'd be really cool and a great driver of conflict, but in summary, we want hardcore Nordic pantheon worshipping, ancient custom adhering Nords who are forced to live amongst Dunmer and so have treated them poorly. Now, before we jump into the other eastern holds, I feel like it would be a good idea to flick over to the other side of the map and discuss the most imperialized hold, and I'm not talking about Haafingar. In this version of Skyrim, it is the Reach that is the most imperialized, and I would make it more congruent with older descriptions of this land. I quote from the first edition guide to the Empire: "Only in the west do the mountains abate to the canyons and mesas of the Reach, by far the most cosmopolitan of the holds of Skyrim, Nords of pure blood holding only the barest majority according to the recent Imperial census." And this makes sense. We have a border zone here with precious resources ripe for the picking. It's placed at the meeting of Hammerfell, High Rock and Skyrim, and in previous lore it was the breadbasket of Skyrim, being the most fertile land in the region. However, 2011 Skyrim's Reach didn't look so fertile. Perhaps that could be fixed. Add a few more live trees and make it appear more lush. We could even have Inca-style terrace farms built down the sides of these mountainous regions, filled with abundant crops. Also, 2011 Skyrim shifted the valuable resources from agriculture to minerals like silver, which is also fine. I don't mind that. I feel like if it's actually both, it's even more reason for it to be a fought-over place. So let's go with both in this version. So as a desired land by all for its mines of silver and fertile land, we end up with a long and turbulent history of fighting between Nords, Bretons, Imperials, Redguards, native Reach folk, and really anyone who wants a slice of the pie. This has resulted in the biggest cultural melting pot of Skyrim, where Nords make up only barely a majority at 35%, the rest being a mix of the other races. Now, before we get too far into the city itself, I do want to refer to the Reachmen a bit and the Markarth incident. So it would have a similar backstory where King Madanach takes over Markarth for the Reachmen during the Great War, and soon after it is taken back by the Jarl, only with the help of Ulfric, on the condition that Shaw's worship would be protected. Now, in response to this, the Forsworn are created, and I like them a lot as a guerrilla warfare based rebel group. However, I think 2011 Skyrim reduced them to an enemy type for the most part, and we don't see peaceful villagers of Reachmen who live out their own existence without being actively hostile. And for a region like the Reach, I see it only fitting that it should be filled with villages and small towns that are majority Reach folk populations who practice their own culture but are not a hostile group. There could be cool story threads about village elders who want to live in peace, but the Forsworn are radicalizing the youths and dragging them off to fight an unwinnable battle, bringing only unnecessary bloodshed. You know the Forsworn quest where you can release King Madanach? Well, that could even start a new questline afterwards if you choose his side, where you can help convince the villagers of the Reach folk to take up arms with him because the king has returned and they have a fighting chance. Hell, at the end of it, it would be cool if instead of Markarth being in Imperial or Stormcloak hands, that instead there is a third option of instating King Madanach, or Ard Madanach as they would say, as the new ruler of the land. But with that said, let's discuss Markarth itself more. I think it would be fair to say that the Reachmen make up about 30% of Markarth's population, so Breton-like people with their own languages and traditions, identifiable by their traditional tattoos or scarification, though not all Reachmen would necessarily do this. So if Markarth City is roughly 30% Reach folk, 35% Nord, well, let's say around 15% would be Redguard and the final 20% would be a mix of Imperial, Bretons, and other races who have come to this trading hub of the West. I think the Dwemer City repurposed is a really cool idea, but I think the city should be expanded outward more, with more modern buildings being created and making up districts of the town. The Dwemer structures and intersections would act as a higher class district, as it is more defensible and indestructible, as well as prestigious. Nords predominantly make up the higher class district, including the Jarl and families like the Silverbloods, but as I mentioned before, Markarth is the perfect opportunity for a melting pot and a spot where we can have other cultures leaked in and mix and interact with the Nords, and yes, I'm talking about things like curved swords. In fact, Markarth is a far better location for the In My Time of Need quest, so rather than Sadia, the Redguard woman hiding in Whiterun, we could have her hiding out in Markarth, and the Alakir warriors have tracked her down for selling out Tanith, and with our enhanced and compressed timeline, it makes far more sense that she's being tracked down for crimes made 5 to 9 years ago instead of over 20 years ago, like in the actual game. Anyways, I just think it would be a better fit. But Markarth should have this melting pot vibe, not only in its population, but in its markets. It's a cross point of land trade as well as a place of abundant resources itself, so it should be reflected. Trade routes from Dragonstar and Evermore would bring all kinds of goods accessible in the Iliac Bay area and bring them to trade in Markarth, which has trade routes with other hubs as such as Solitude and Whiterun. But back to Markarth itself. The markets and economy should be a central part of this city. Trading companies companies, mercs and security businesses, farming, mining, craftsmen, and imperial administration. The Empire here provides the Jarl Igmund with plenty of imperial troops to bolster his power and keep the Reachmen suppressed, as well as keeping the Stormcloaks from taking it. If the Reach was lost to the Stormcloaks, the Empire would lose a big resource and would risk being divided by land, with Markarth no longer connecting Falkreath and High Rock. As with all melting pots, we would get a mix of religion. The Imperial cult, aka the Divines, would be predominant, but we may also get some Yakutan-based religious practices come in via Crown Red Guards, and of course with the Reachmen we would have their unique pantheon of spirits that they worship, which are mostly Daedra. And before I mentioned the Imperial College of the Voice, founded by Tiber Septim, in the hopes that it may one day provide soldiers that can use the thumb in defense of the Empire. Well, for a time it was popular, when it was cool and new back at the start of the Third Era, but over time, with the realization of the dedication it required, it failed to be financially feasible. It had been opened and closed multiple times throughout the centuries of the Third Era because of differing circumstances, but in the wake of the Oblivion crisis, it was reopened and made popular again. People were scared more than ever of typical magical practices because of the association with Oblivion and Daedra, which, by the way, is why the Mages Guild was dissolved in Cyrodiil. However, the Nords could see the thumb as a holy and reverent type of magic. The voice was sacred and not profane, and so it became a popular alternative for a while. Once again, the impracticality of learning the voice and the introspection and determination it required made it a poor alternative to the practicality of typical magic, and so over the 60 years of the Fourth Era, it became less and less popular. Jarl Igmund, who is incredibly rich, keeps it alive as a symbol of greatness and prestige in his city, but it's hardly practical. The practitioners who learn there are adept at best, and many of them have abandoned the college for Windhelm and have instead chosen to learn under Ulfric and his disciple tongues, the idea being that living as a true Nord and worshipping the old gods is what allows for greater connection to the way of the voice. How is one to master the thumb when worshipping pale shadows of kind such as the Imperial Kinnereth? And a final note to talk about Markarth is of course the Dwemer city it is built out of. This of course would attract many Dwemer researchers such as Cal Semo, and hence it has become somewhat of a hub for Dwemer scholarship. With Morrowind blanketed in ash or in chaos, it is no longer easily accessible. Since then, Dwemer researchers diverted to Skyrim and Hammerfell mostly, with Markarth being a Dwemer city itself, and smack in the middle of both places, it makes it the perfect hub for research and artifact collection. But now we've discussed both polar opposites somewhat, the incredibly cosmopolitan and imperialized Reach, a melting pot of races and subcultures, and Eastmarch, home of the traditional Nords, set on returning Skyrim to the old ways and casting off the Empire. So now let's get to the middle ground, Whiterun. In the game Skyrim, this is the tipping point of the war, the ninth hold, the balance of power. Jarl Balgruuf the Greater seems very intent on supporting Whiterun and Whiterun first, but he also accepts the rule of the Empire over Ulfric. Also, he does sympathize though because of his secret Talos worship. However, in this fun version, he holds onto his reverence of Shor secretly instead, as well as the rest of the Nordic pantheon more openly, and he becomes increasingly disenfranchised with the encroaching imperialization that has occurred as a byproduct of the White Gold Concordat. But as for the city and hold itself, we can undoubtedly say that Whiterun was heavily inspired by the Lord of the Rings, and the city is basically modeled off Edoras, the capital city of Rohan. I mean, even their sigil is that of a horse. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm all here for it. I think it's a really beautiful city, cool landscape, and cool themes with the various districts, though they need to be much bigger. But the main thing I would want from a revamped Whiterun is horses. We want them to feel like the horse lords who rule over these plains. Where are the famous horse breeders, the patrols on horseback, thanes and housecarls sporting beautifully armored horses? I reckon that Whiterun should be accessible via horses, and with a bigger cloud district there could be a stable up there, and you could have horses making their way through the crowds, winding up to the palace. The guard armor replacer mod does a fantastic job of redesigning their guard's armor, plus gives some cool noble armor to the Jarl and his brother, and I think this is a must-have for a revamped Skyrim. Now, Horses, and lots of them, give many advantages. It's much easier to patrol and guard a large span of territory, couriers can relay information faster, trade is much easier with horse-drawn carts. Essentially, an abundance of horses and a central position in Skyrim could make Whiterun quite the hub. Now, one thing Skyrim originally I feel didn't have explored well enough is the Thanes. We understand that a Jarl has Thanes, kind of like a Baron equivalent, you could say. Essentially, lords, but of course with a Nordic, honor culture-bound flavor. All of the holds should have a variety of Thanes that have stewardship over certain villages or keeps spread throughout the land, and I think Whiterun in particular is such an important example considering its size and ability to traverse. Rorikstead should be run by a Thane in a keep, whose duty is to keep giant clans at bay and watch the borders of the Reach. There should be keeps and villages like this scattered throughout the plains, as well as one of them available to the player if they were to become Thane. Imagine becoming Thane and having land granted to you where you may build your keep and farm and such however you like. But Thanes as characters are important. It would be interesting if Riverwood had a Thane who kept the border to Falkreath safe and also administered the lumber trade. He could have a small hall complete with hearth, servants, and trophies of his life. Displaying trophies for Thanes and Jarls would be a point of pride. They are a people who take valor, honor, and great accomplishments worthy of song as the most desirable traits. So then we should see nobles and important characters flexing their feats. Ultimately, this makes Whiterun and really any hold feel much more like a small country of its own hold, with its own cultural identity and feel of sovereignty. Yes, there is an underlying culture and religion, but each hold should feel like a particular flavor of Nordic state, complete with their own hierarchy and internal politics. And speaking of such, it should be divided as it is the conflict hold, so to say. Instead of the Imperial versus Stormcloak debate thing, here have an axe, let's start a war, we should see more build-up. The Hall of Dragon's Reach should at one point, for a quest, be filled with all the various Thanes who end up in a conflicted debate about who to back. Remember, each of these Thanes are from clans that have run the same keeps and villages, who have cavalry and soldiers who pledge loyalty to them, and the threat of them peeling off and betraying the Jarl is present. The whole Greymane and Battleborn feud should be much larger and feel more significant than just a small family affair. Both Ulfrid, Battleborn, and Vignar Greymane should be Thanes who have their own keeps and villages as well as mansions within the Whiterun city. We would want them to truly feel like the rich and influential families as they are described. They would personify the central conflict that threatens to tear apart Whiterun if Bolgroth cannot maintain his power. As an extra note, I think that Bolgroth should be able to be convinced to Ulfric's side. Perhaps it's very hard to achieve and very conditional, but there are also conditions where he is replaced by Vignar as usual. In Whiterun, we also have the Companions, which is a faction we have talked about plenty on the channel and a faction we would like revamped. But since their home location is Whiterun and they are such a Skyrim-wide renowned faction, they should bear a reasonable amount of influence on the culture, and I would argue that instead of giving the Companions this sort of flavorless, impartial type of mercenary band character, they should instead be true Nords. They should be the local force pushing the Jarl to preserve their ways. I mean, they venerate Ysgramor for crying out loud. This could be a tense conflict and balancing game for the Jarl to maintain. Companions, along with the Greymane clan, are staunchly true Nords. And you have preachers screaming illegally about Shore, and on the other hand, you have the Battleborns and Avenici, who have helped Whiterun profit in recent years. So we have this internal conflict for Bolgroth, who ultimately wants a Nordic Whiterun with the old gods, Shore and such, but at the same time, he's dependent on the Empire and is not ready to cut ties. And this conflict should not only be within him, but shown throughout the whole city. Whiterun, at the center of the Civil War's borders, should be the most conflicted city politically. Also, we should consider that Whiterun, with all the horses and lots of flat land, should have the best cavalry of Skyrim, and hence an even more important force to have on your side of the Civil War. Alright, now let's head west to the mysterious lands of Hjaalmarch and its city of Morthal. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to make one thing clear. Dawnstar, Morthal, Falkreath, and Winterhold were done dirty, and they need a healthy revamp ideally. No longer just thatched houses, each place should have its own distinct architecture like the other 5 cities, and each should feel unique in its own right. But with that said, let's start talking about Morthal. Morthal is situated on the edge of a swamp, and much of the hold is like this, resulting in a place of a rather poor wealth sustained almost entirely by lumber harvesting and the mining town of Stonehills, which provides iron. Now, Morthal in the original game is being run by Jarl Igrod Ravencrone, who is a little bit esoteric, so to say. She's a mystic, she sees visions of prophecy and places her trust in higher powers. Of course, Morthal is also home to Falkreath the wizard, and there are vampires afoot nearby, including the whole quest with the ghost girl and so on. So if we were to sum up Morthal's theme with a thesis statement, I would say it's the creepy horror town in a backwater. And it's a good theme, it's a nice change up, but I think it's something that could be doubled down on. See, we get lip service to the whole mystic thing, but it's never explored thoroughly. But for starters, we'd want the actual town itself to be enhanced, probably something like the Great Towns and Cities mod, just to give it a bit of an aesthetic identity. Now, if you have this poor town that only really makes any wealth out of lumber and iron, what else can we do here? For starters, I would suggest that if there were bogs in the swamps nearby, you could have people who go in to harvest peat, which is a useful product for making powerful fires. Additionally, herbalists and alchemists may set up shop, and the swamp may be a plentiful source of potent alchemical ingredients, and hence the town almost has this freelancer economy of adventurers and pickers who navigate the dangerous swamps to harvest peat and find specific ingredients in order to turn a profit in this low prosperity town. Combined with the dangers of vampire lairs, frostbite spiders, and other monsters, the swamp makes a wet grave for many, and in part because the people are desperate to make a living. Necromancers also begin taking up residence in the swamp and nearby, thanks to the availability of many corpses and preserved bodies in the bogs. Morthal is a place without the dignity and prestige of a lot of other places in Skyrim, and we want this to be seen throughout. We want to maintain the gritty feel, but also the mystical one. Based on the necessity to get creative with money making, we'll often find street magicians and illusionists or seers and fortune tellers who claim to be able to see your future for a fee. Some will make you love potions or elixirs that attract gold. Some will genuinely provide you with powerful insights or potions. Some are basically full of it. The place gains a reputation as a home of mystics and charlatans, and it's very hard to tell which is which. Of course, this culture is headed by Jarl Igrod Ravencrone, who is a mystic herself, and she maintains a very open mind about things, which sometimes grates against the superstitions of local Nords. But this in turn has made Morthal a home for people such as Falkreath, her court wizard, or members of the Imperial cult. Even some Daedric cultists have been made welcome in some degree, of course, as long as no laws are broken. The Jarl herself believes in the Nord gods such as Kain and Junal, but she is a student of comparative religion, and she finds mystical truths in all faiths. Morthal is even home to Dunmer, Khajiit, and Argonians in small numbers who can practice their native religions rather openly compared to the rest of Skyrim. You will also find traders selling interesting religious and cult artifacts from around the place, trading trinkets, amulets, and statuettes of gods, even Daedra. It'd be cool to even see like a somewhat devious cult to Orki, also known as Old Knocker or the Death God. He in the Nordic pantheon is symbolized by a snake, and he's been an antagonistic figure for the Nordic gods, a Loki-type character in ways. So let's imagine that there is this unpopular, even amongst the Nords, sort of nihilistic death cult that revere Orki, kind of like our world equivalent of satanic cults. Just an idea, but Morthal would be the perfect place for that. Overall, due to the land lacking economic prosperity, Morthal has had to offer other advantages and niche services. In this case, it's a religious freedom of sorts and a place of mystical and magical services. Many outcasts and unwelcomed of Nordic society find their place here. It's truly a backwater vibe town, and hence a lot of its quirks are overlooked by the rest of Skyrim because it remains rather unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Of course, there are true Nords, with which there are local tensions, and of course there are its own problems with necromancers, vampires, and general swamp monsters, but ultimately it would be a unique town for Skyrim that provides more of a mystical swamp-like experience that it was going for. Okay, time to start moving west to east. So let's start at the westernmost place we haven't talked about yet, and that is Solitude, the capital hold of Haafingar. Solitude is a cool city in design, but bruh, It's the capital of Skyrim. Let's make it a tad bigger, you know? From the front gate, the city should be sprawling down to the level of the water, creating entire new districts with narrow streets of diverse shops and merchants. Solitude is an economic powerhouse and is connected to the sea, and this should be seen with merchants everywhere. Sprawling markets, the East Empire Trading Company made busy, and the local tax agents and banks are having a field day every day. Wealthy is a good way to describe Solitude. Now, while the Reach may have a lot of wealth, it also has its fair share of problems with the Reachmen and such a mixed population where cultural tensions remain heated always. Solitude, on the other hand, is still predominantly Nord in population, with Imperials and Bretons making up the secondary majorities. Solitude is also Markarth's primary connection to the sea trading routes, and hence a lot of the Reach's economic prosperity is passed through and traded out of Solitude. Here we see many sailors and ship captains in the city and taverns looking for jobs or resting before they sail out with cargo loaded. Nords are also historically good sailors, and there are many recruits found for the Imperial Navy here. Naturally, since Solitude is both the capital of Skyrim and the seat of Imperial power in the region, there should be a large presence of the Imperial Legion and the Imperial cult. The Temple of the Divines is there, and in it we find many Nords flocking to and converting to this new faith, including the Jarl Elisif herself. There should be a culture of cooperation and reverence for the Empire, and we should see this crossroads and mixing of culture, not just Imperial armored Nords. Yes, these Nords may be very pro-Empire. Yes, they may have converted to the Imperial cult, but they're still Nords and have cultural roots in this land and its traditions. So while they may not be wearing bear skins and shouting praise to Kine as they fight elves, they still maintain cultural elements of Nordic life, such as love of battle, drinking, feastings, song, and even superstitions. But instead of honor battles to the death, think formal duels. Instead of mead swilled from a horn, think wine drunk from the barrel. Instead of reverent feasts of the gods, think gorging on bread and suckling pig. Instead of songs of Ysgramor's conquest, think of Nord-led victories for the Empire. Instead of overt and practiced superstitions, think subtle ones. It would actually be really interesting to see Imperial preachers attempting to consolidate and appropriate these native Nordic traditions to help make religious conversion easier. Think like how Halloween's roots are from an ancient Celtic festival called Samhain, where it is believed that at this time that barriers to the physical world and the spiritual world break down, allowing for more interactions between humans and spirits. And in modern beliefs, it's all spooky ghosts come out. But with similar principles, it would be cool to see the Imperial cult sort of co-opt and imperialize the Nordic traditions for a smooth transition. Now, you may remember the letdown that was the Bard's College. Well, we need to improve that and make it a much bigger part of the culture here. This is what was said in the Pocket Guide. Founded during Skyrim's long Elysian flirtation, the Bard's College continues to flaunt a heretical streak, and its students are famous carousers, fittingly enough for their chosen trade. Students yearly invade the marketplace for a week of revelry, at the climax of which is the burning of King Olaf in effigy, possibly a now forgotten contender in the War of Succession. Graduates have no trouble finding employment in the noble households across Tamriel, including the restored Imperial Court in Cyrodiil, but many choose to follow in the wandering footsteps of illustrious alumni such as Kalissos and Morakelis. Bards are everywhere in Skyrim, and song and stories are paramount to their culture, but the Bard's College possesses that heretical streak. The students are not afraid of indulging in other ideas and versions of events that differ from the orthodox, such as they are with King Olaf. But this should be expanded more. Oh, and the Bard's College should be a joinable faction with ranks and the like. It would help if you can play music for gold, perhaps even craft instruments or find legendary such ones as the pan flute of Morakelis. However, the musical aspect is not the only part. Being a bard is not just about having a good voice and a string. In Morrowind, the class is described like this. Bards are lawmasters and storytellers. They crave adventure for the wisdom and insight to be gained, and must depend on sword, shield, spell, and enchantment to preserve them from the perils of their educational experiences. Lawmasters and storytellers. The Bard's College should be a place where you are encouraged to seek out adventures in ruins of old and build stories and philosophies about the world to write into song. In ways, the Bard's College is the Nordic pursuit of a creative life. And perhaps there should even be a bunch of Dibella worshippers here, but ultimately it should have that free ideas kind of alternative thinking. A philosopher's faction which questions dogma, not to provide another alternative, as is done in the wars of politics and religion, like what is happening with the Imperial Stormcloak conflict of today, but to merely question and ponder, to seek the growth of the mind in search for truth and meaning. Perhaps this would put them at odds at times with the local Thalmor embassy who are here to ensure the Nordic pantheon's abolition. In the same way they are defiant in their view of King Olaf, so they should be defiant in whatever views they hold. And let us not forget that this is an educational place. There should be people from all walks of life, mages, soldiers, tavern wenches, priests even. All these people are united by a love for song and story, a life in the creative pursuits. As a player, we should be very much able to be a part of this faction, and it should have an entire questline as well as an actual way to be a bard. Like I said, through playing instruments or even reciting stories to people in taverns, all the way up to Jarls in their halls. Singing songs of epic histories may actually engage players with the lore in a more active way by making knowledge of this lore part of the gameplay experience rather than mostly peripherals in the form of books. But in summary, imperialized Nords, imperial navy, lots of sailors, bustling markets with merchants from all over Skyrim and Tamriel, lots of bards in training, and the college itself has a massive influence on the local culture. Also, Solitude is just really big and sprawls a lot more. Okay, so moving across but south, we have the Falkreath Hold, and of course the city itself, which is Falkreath. Okay, so you know Falkreath, town in a boreal forest, sits in a basin with a big lake nearby. Yes, it should be bigger, but also a little different looking. It needs a big tomb and a graveyard. The Great Cities and Towns mod does a great job at uplifting the place, but let's get into it. In the lore, there are 3 core elements that stand out. First, it's economically reliant on lumber, because trees. Look around, that's abundantly clear. Beautiful woodwork should also be abundant. 2, historically it is known as the Hero's Graveyard. Many great battles took place here for centuries, and countless warriors were buried here, leaving behind graves and monuments to them. So, there is a melancholy to the place. And finally, something that is not often mentioned, but it has Colovian roots. While modern Falkreath is considered a Nordic hold, in times past it has been one of the northernmost Colovian estates. In fact, King Culhane, the guy who Tiber Septim was initially helping as a general, was the petty king of Falkreath, which was at the time part of the Colovian estates. For those who need a quick refresher, imperial culture is roughly divided into Colovian, west and northwest, and Nibonese, east and south cultures. The Nibonese are generally more magical and exotic, diverse and varied with many cults and so on, whereas the Colovians or Syro-Nordics are traditionally more straight-edge, uniforms, orthodox and warlike imperials. So Falkreath by default has a lot more imperial Colovian background in its history, and I suppose this is what made it rather natural to side with the Imperials over the Stormcloaks. So simple ask, bring back the Colovian fur helm. But in truth, this is a perfect place to see a mix of Colovians and Nords. Of all the Jarls, it would make the most sense to me to have the most Count-like or Cyrodiilic feeling one be here. Granted, Skyrim actually did a good job with Jarl Siggeir, who is placed there by the Imperials and who revels in hunts and feasts and luxury. A man who seems to enjoy the trappings of Nordic society and prestige that comes with it, but who in actuality is rather soft, a puppet. Solitude is the capital of Skyrim, and the king of course has to hold Nordic values for the people. And the Reach has also been fought over tirelessly by the Nords, and Markarth is cosmopolitan by circumstance more so than implementation, whereas Falkreath quite literally was considered part of the Colovian estates and hence imperial in the past. It's only natural that its Jarl should be most imperial-like. Anyways, core to Skyrim is the conflict between the Empire and the Stormcloaks, and in this version we double down and make it a core religious and cultural conflict of Nordic tradition versus the imperialized way, which is now being pushed because of the White Gold Concordat. Now, we've talked about this conflict through different lenses in different cities, and here in Falkreath we have a unique example. In the city, there should be a cultural conflict between Nord and Colovian. There are those who feel as if they should be more like Nords and embrace their traditions and gods, aka Stormcloak supporters, secretly of course, and then there are those who treat Falkreath as an extension of Cyrodiil, like the Jarl kind of does. Perhaps there is an inner conspiracy for the Imperials to maneuver the Jarl into accepting a treaty which would declare Falkreath part of Cyrodiil, which is something that even imperialized Nords would not like, but in the chaos of the Civil War, it's possible. Perhaps the player can have some part in uncovering this plot made by the Penitus Oculatus agents working with Clovian nobles, and you can assist their plot to make Falkreath part of Cyrodiil province, uniting it with the Clovian estates once more, or you can thwart the plot to make it remain part of Skyrim. Choice is yours. The other important part about Falkreath is this hero's graveyard bit. Now, we saw a graveyard in Skyrim, but it looked as if it would fit a village. What we want instead is a big graveyard and a giant ancient Nordic tomb of catacombs for burials of heroes past. There should also be a sort of culture built around death here, with arcade playing an important part. Perhaps even a Day of the Dead type festival takes place here, and deathly motif items are sold, or amulets and prayer beads, or even people selling flowers for the graves of loved ones. There could be some cool grave robber themed quests or a necromancer type thing, but we don't want to overdo them. Hunting should also play a decent role in the culture, and poachers may be rife in the area. Overall, I feel like Falkreath could just be made more distinct by playing into the Clovian heritage and also playing into this hero's graveyard part. It would be a great way to explore the funeral rites of different cultures. Perhaps the Nordic versus Imperial way of things is a point of contention. Local Nords are unhappy with the way that their families have been interred by Imperial priests. Stuff like that. Let's head north. It's time to talk about the true Nords, the Nords of the North, the Nords of the Pale, the hardy, elemental Nords of old who live among the ice and storms. Such are the northern men of Dawnstar. Now, Dawnstar in OG Skyrim is pretty plain, and like I've mentioned, there are mods to give it a nice facelift, but at the end of the day, it's a town in the snow. It does have the benefit of a memorable Vaemina Nightmare quest, which is set there, and the ancient Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary is also there, but overall I feel like it's one of the least memorable towns. However, we want to change that, and how are we going to do that? Well, we've been talking about the Nords for a while now, and we want to use older incarnations of the lore to flesh out Skyrim, so listen to how they're described. Nords are also natural seamen and have benefited from nautical trade since their first migrations from Atmora. They captain and crew many merchant fleets and may be found all along the coasts of Tamriel. Now, in terms of feeling, we have Solitude to give that big merchant feeling, trading hub kind of vibe. And we don't want to just replicate that because it would start feeling like Solitude Light. But what is unique about Dawnstar? Well, its position. It's one of the northernmost cities that leads straight onto the Sea of Ghosts. The seas they navigate are brutal and iceberg filled, and I think what would be a cool theme here is to lean in on the Viking inspirations. Here in Dawnstar, they are renowned sailors, but more specifically with the smaller longboats of the Nords, built to more efficiently navigate the icebergs of the frozen north. They also make for quick travel and are excellent ships to stage raids and skirmishes from. The Nords of Dawnstar are believers in the traditional Nordic ways. They hunt hawker and whales, and do some trading also to supplement their economy, but one of their primary sources of income is raiding, and who better to attack than your ancestral enemies, the elves. In our timeline, Morrowind has removed itself from the Empire in favour of sovereignty when Titus Mede first took the throne, and this opened a fresh new opportunity for the Nords of Dawnstar. They once again began raiding the shores of Morrowind as small groups of Vikings plundering their lands, but now the Dunmer are more vulnerable than ever and the pickings are easy. Dawnstar raiders plunder the Redoran territories of the north and even staged an attempt to retake Solstheim at one point, but it was repelled. They often raid tombs and settlements in the Sheogorad region, and at times they have ventured past the West Gash and down the Bitter Coast raiding villages. Once they even organized a raid of Blacklight, which was partially successful. Pillage and plunder is a way of life for the men and women of Dawnstar, and it's this bountiful yet brutal life that brings some measure of prosperity to the region. It's also worth a mention that in recent times, many of these raids have been redirected to Imperial-controlled lands as a contribution to the war effort. Many Imperial ships have been attacked, and the men of Dawnstar have sailed as far as Daggerfall to harass Imperial territories. Jarl Skald the Elder is a fierce supporter of the Stormcloaks. I would say that he is undoubtedly loyal to Ulfric Stormcloak, and he will fight the Empire to his last breath. They also have this particular reverence for Stun, the Nordic version of Stendar. For starters, he is symbolized as the whale, which is a vital animal for the people of Dawnstar who hunt them for food, but also blubber to make oil and soap. Secondly, Stendar is the divine of mercy, and Stun similarly embodies a Nordic version of mercy, and that is ransom. Stun is the god of ransom, fraternity, and justice, and he showed the Nords how to take and the benefits of taking prisoners of war. And as they do this, Dawnstar grows its stockades. The Dawnstar prison is filled with prisoners of war and captures to ransom. Imperial soldiers, Bretons, Dunmer, all set to be ransomed, yet in the meantime, before their return and ransom secured, they are set to work manual labor in the mines. The people's culture, gods, and traditions are so intrinsically intertwined with their way of life that you will barely find anyone here in support of the Empire. Even those who look favorably on the Empire, such as Brina Marillis, would not forsake the old gods willingly. So in this version of the Pale, expect to see longboats, round shields, axes, prisoners of war, and coffers full of plunder from far-off places. This is the epitome of the Viking-inspired culture. But now let's move next door to Winterhold. Ah yes, Winterhold, the place in Skyrim that almost doesn't exist save for the College of Winterhold, which is by far the worst incarnation of a magic guild in the Elder Scrolls so far. No, you can't have a good magic guild, we have a magic guild at home. Come home, open the fridge, and Savos Aran says, "Here, your archmage, enjoy running home-brand Hogwarts." Well, criticisms aside, let's build a better Winterhold. Now, of course, it's easy to just axe the Great Collapse and say, build a giant city. Sure, it'd be cool, but the Great Collapse is a part of 4th Era lore, and I want to try and make it work, because I believe it's a cop-out to say, well, it's a collapsed city and they can't do much. So, in this compressed timeline, we have to remember that the Great Collapse happened a mere 5 years ago, which makes the wounds fresh, and people alive will actually remember the city they lost. Perhaps many fled to Whiterun, Windhelm, and Dawnstar, and perhaps this should be noticeable in other cities, because think about it, it's an entire city that used to be the ancient capital of Skyrim that just fell into the sea. Plenty would be dead, sure, but then many would have been injured or survived, and so refugees from here should be shown in other cities. However, unlike the original Winterhold, in this version, we're actually going to see an active attempt to rebuild in the 5 years since. Tensions being high with the College of Winterhold is good, and I think it's an interesting plot point as to why the college is left standing where the city is not, and perhaps this could be revealed through a quest by exploring the hidden caverns and houses of vast wreckage that is sunk into the sea. It'd actually be a rather cool exploration zone with sunken buildings that you need to maneuver into that reveal treasures and further collapsed structures. The potential for environmental storytelling here is insane. Also, Argonian's water breathing and the water breathing spell might actually be put to some use. Speaking of treasures, there could be employment from certain families to recover lost heirlooms, or treasure hunters who are seeking to uncover the vault full of gold that was once part of the Winterhold Bank or Treasury. But as for the survivors, we would still have fairly recently constructed buildings, and there would be a bit of a tent city formed around, trailing the path to the older gates. Wooden scaffolding and crane structures have been built to excavate and rebuild, and mages have tents set up to assist in the reconstruction and recovery efforts. The college mages are here in force, trying to improve relations desperately, considering that many blame the college in the first place. The College of Winterhold in this version of Skyrim is not this vague academic institution where it feels like an unpopulated budget mages guild. Instead, it is the pinnacle of magical instruction in the north, home to the Hermetic Orders of Junal, the Nordic version of Julianos. To the ancient Nords, he was the rune god of knowledge and wisdom, patron of the clever men, the ancient Nord name for those gifted in the arcane arts. Junal, over the millennia of Skyrim's history, has largely fallen out of favour with the Nords of generally anti-magical sentiment, paying lip service to Junal tacked to the end of their list of greater gods. However, The College of Winterhold has held tradition of the ancient hermetic orders of clever men, and have since endeavoured to increase the standing of the arcane arts amongst the Nords, an effort which feels like an uphill battle at times. This is also where most of the court wizards come from. Nords typically don't like magic users, so it's helpful when they come from a more culturally aligned group like the Hermetic Orders of Hjaalmarch. Besides the many practical benefits the college has brought in its time since its foundation, it also gets afforded a degree of protection by its religious association with Hjaalmarch. The college has many a times used their reverence of Hjaalmarch as justification for their continued arcane practices, and even the truest of Nords would not dare move against such a claim, for to do so would shame the gods. However, reasoning aside, the College of Winterhold is very much a practical and academic organization with the trappings of a cult dedicated to Hjaalmarch. Many of the motifs, the statues, the clothing and such is very inspired by Hjaalmarch, who is represented as an owl. Members of the college sport interesting owl-inspired robes, similar to the style of the Archmage robes in the original Skyrim. You'd want an interesting mix of academic uniform, the classical mage robes, but also with cultish motifs. The Archmage is also a Nord. Whether fair or not, the legitimacy of the college as a hermetic order devoted to Hjaalmarch would certainly come into question if a dark elf like Savos Aaron was running the show. Honestly, I think Tolfdir should be the Archmage instead, and perhaps even instead of that title it should be something like High Owl Tolfdir or something unique, rather than just a carbon copy of the Mages Guild. Externally, we want the people referring to the college members as monk-like, and there is very much a religious perception of the college in order to bring legitimacy. However, internally there are many non-Nord members, and it's a far more academic institution. And let's not forget that it's not just about magic, but also scholarly pursuits like history, calculations, and inventions. Of course, there are various masters of respective schools, and we would want the place to be populated by apprentices and new students, but we could go on forever about possible improvements to the College of Winterhold, and this video is already huge, so perhaps another time. But now, let's focus on the actual populace of Winterhold, as well as the Jarl and the nobility's interactions with the college and the rest of the world. Jarl Corir is just as distrustful of the college as he is in the base game. However, because of its religious associations, as a follower of the old gods, he cannot openly attack their legitimacy. Additionally, he is put in a position that the college loves. He is increasingly dependent on the engineers and mages of the college that are helping him in the reconstruction effort, and so he cannot afford to lose them, lest he want to lose his dream to rebuild the city. Outside the internal politics, Winterhold has a sturdy mining industry, but it is one of the less profitable holds, especially since local commerce and infrastructure has been devastated. Jarl Corir, like most Nords, was a worshipper of the Nordic pantheon, yet he was by no means opposed to the Empire. Pre-Great Collapse, Winterhold benefited from the East Empire Trading Company and its connections to the broader Empire. However, when Winterhold sunk into the Sea of Ghosts, the Empire, still busy with the reconstruction efforts in Cyrodiil, could barely afford to send any help at all, and this felt like a personal attack to Jarl Corir. Ulfric Stormcloak, however, stepped in and sent men and indentured Dunmer labourers to help in the rebuilding effort, in part funding its restoration, considering it to be an important place of Nordic culture and history. Additionally, Stormcloak troops had been sent to Winterhold to patrol its territories and secure its lands from bandit threats, and for this, Jarl Corir has become eternally grateful to Ulfric and has sided with the Stormcloaks. And now on to the final of the holds. The Rift. The eastern city of Riften stands at the shores of Lake Honrick. In the original game, Riften has quite the nice environment, and it's home to the Thieves Guild. In theme, it's kind of presented as a bit of a criminal haven with the Blackbriar family and their illicit connections. The fact that you get shaken down by the guards as you first enter the city shows as much. Riften is a place with an underbelly contrasted with the Temple of Mara and an active priesthood, as well as some honest folk, and even the Jarl is named Layla Lawgiver, who seems earnest in her motives to do the city good, yet her influence and capability is debated. We want to keep all of this, but first we got to get some additional bits to discuss. In the lore, and I mean not older incarnations of the lore, I mean Skyrim era lore, we have the Book of Crossed Daggers, the history of Riften, and it gives us some insights. The once proud streets and buildings have vanished and have been replaced with a collection of wooden structures and rough stonework shrouded in a permanent fog-like mist. In order to understand how such a large city became nothing more than a glorified fortress, one need only look to the history books for answers. To quickly summarize, this book goes on to explain that there was a bad Jarl and then an uprising, and this burnt down the larger city, so it's replaced with a shoddier Riften that we see today. I don't mind this, but I feel like we get robbed of a larger city. However, I actually quite like Riften as it is, and it ends up being quite memorable. Also, having a larger city having been there prior explains why there is such a large sewer system. Anyways, how to improve this? In this version, Riften was still burnt down, but stone does not disappear, especially not all the stone of a large and important city. So I suggest that Riften is the city by the lake, the Riften we are familiar with, but surrounding it, to the east and south, are complexes of old city ruins that are the size of 2 or more Riftens. These larger ruins are the remnants of the city that mostly burnt to the ground, but now it has become a hiding place for squatters and thieves. The guard is stretched too thin to even bother defending it, and instead, smaller walls and gates have been built, sectioning off the rebuilt city from the old ruins to the south and east. The sewers also expand this far, and it is this network of tunnels that the Thieves Guild exploit, in addition to a variety of other vagrants and smugglers. The guard almost never come down here. They turn a blind eye most often because they are stretched far too thin. Hell, they're more likely to shake you down than turn you in. This is why Maven Blackbriar is the real power of Riften, running its underbelly. In the past, according to the same book, Riften was a major hub of activity for trade caravans and travellers to and from Morrowind. Fishing skiffs could be seen dotting the lake at all hours of the day, and the bustling city was alive with activity at night. The city guard was formidable and maintained a tight grasp on its populace, keeping them safe from harm. The marketplace in Riften was also quite a draw, containing numerous stands offering wares from across Tamriel. So we need to consider its position next to Morrowind. Now, we aren't going to have a Grey Quarter 2.0, however we would see a higher Dunmer population than other places, and we would see Dunmer Gwar caravans with guards in bone mold and chitin armor protecting them. The ruined city would also be home to Dunmer squatters, who can set up here with little worries from the guard. However, they have not been able to amass large numbers because they get edged out by Nords and others. Last thing to mention about the Dunmer is that many of them would have come to Riften after the eruption of Red Mountain, yet compared to the Grey Quarter and Windhelm, they have assimilated quite well, and the reason is likely twofold. Windhelm's Nordic population are amongst the most traditionalist, and they have fought House Redoran at the border for thousands of years, resulting in a particular animosity for their kind. Whereas on the other hand, Riften was too busy trading with the Dunmer, creating a mutual fattening of the pockets. Of course, Riften is no prejudice safe haven, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that some good coin can often make people forget even their deepest held beliefs. The other much needed component to Riften is an expanding of the docks region with an extension of houses built out across the water, bringing in skiffs full of fish and sending goods to settlements across the Lake District. There would be smugglers with fish barrels filled with skooma and guards being paid to turn a blind eye, and all kinds of duplicitous activity. This dock area expands straight onto the lower level of Riften, where we would see many hovels made into the old foundations, skirted by boardwalks sitting over the water, clothing lines hanging above, buckets of waste being dumped from above to below. This is where you see many beggars and vagrants who get kicked to the lower levels as to maintain a sense of normalcy up top. Overall, I think in essence, what we want to do here is skew things towards the poorer classes. In 2011 Riften, everything feels a little small. Like the guards should be able to handle the Thieves Guild all holed up in one spot. There's barely any city to patrol as well. We want the feeling of this bloated underbelly that is so big that all the law can do is throw a tarp over and mask it in as much perfume as possible. So you walk around Riften up top, look down to the water, and you see boardwalks full of undesirables. The sewer, or the Ratway as it is called, is almost a city unto itself. The system sprawls out into the surrounding ruins of the old city and provides access all over. So with a small guard force and 2 whole Riftens worth of ruins and a sprawling sewer system beneath, it makes sense they can't really stop or control the Thieves Guild in any meaningful way. And the last thing to mention is the overall culture in relation to the Imperial conflict, and I think the groundwork is there for a rather natural conclusion. Riften is a place rife with contradiction, and that would be its central theme. Jarl Layla Lawgiver presides over perhaps the most lawless city in Skyrim. She is also a supposed staunch proponent of the Stormcloak movement, and yet her ear is controlled by the Blackbriars and her council, which can rationalize away her values when necessary. Riften has an expansive criminal underworld and problems with poverty, yet the surviving city itself parades as a beautiful, proud city, kicking all its dirt to the lower levels where it cannot be seen. We also have, in quotations, true Nords who fight the Empire on the basis of maintaining tradition and honor, yet many of them are just like the Empire. When coin is involved, suddenly there's a lot less go back to Morrowind Greyskin and a lot more pleasure doing business with you, as he pays a smuggler for a shipment of skooma, ready to be taken to the youth of Iverstead and other farming towns with many individuals looking for something to cut the monotony. Perhaps this is something that could be shown in the outcomes of the Civil War. If you side with the Imperials, Maven Blackbriar takes over and things remain very similar, whereas if the Stormcloaks are victorious, with few Imperial troubles in Skyrim itself, Stormcloak reinforcements are sent to clean up the city and now patrol the ruins and hang skooma dealers and thieves in the streets. So this turned into a very long video, and there are still things that I didn't discuss, such as the plot, because without dragons it would be radically different, and there are so many possibilities. I mean, if people really want me to, I could write a main story for this setting, but in this video I really wanted to play with the world building and sort of take all these holds and give them a greater sense of identity and variety, plus the fixed timeline and the context for the Fourth Era I think greatly improves storytelling opportunities. So yeah, give me your thoughts on this idealized Skyrim. I should also say hindsight is 2020, and it's easier to fix something rather than start from scratch. However, if you want an example of something like that, you can check out our ideal Elder Scrolls 6 Hammerfell linked below, which was a giant exercise in world building, plot, and world design. But at the end of the day, we do all this for fun, and I'd love to hear what you think below. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.